good morning or good evening from wherever you're joining us. I am Susan Barashai, founder of C Admissions, and today we have a special topic where we're discussing applicants who are considering an MBA program that come from a healthcare background. So if you're watching this, most of you here then have been spending years building a clinical or industry career that is genuinely substantial. And you're now trying to figure out how can you translate as clearly as possible into an MBA application. That is the right question to ask, and it's the one we're going to work through today. Before we dive in, however, we have been noticing that a lot of you are engaging with our content, but haven't necessarily subscribed. So it would be really helpful if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which helps the algorithm say that essentially share our content with other people just like you who are going through this process. With that, why don't we get started? Most healthcare professionals who research the MBA, who research and are obviously at their MBA stage, have done genuinely consequential work. Perhaps you've spent time as a clinical practitioner, a drug processed or helped move a drug to phase 3 in its development, managed perhaps a team of individuals at scale. And the instinct is to lead with that weight. And it's a reasonable instinct because inside medicine and pharma, that experience really speaks. Admission committees at M7, so Harvard, Wharton, Kellogg, and others, are not reading it the way your healthcare ecosystem and pharma ecosystem does. What registers as exceptional inside the clinical or industry context doesn't automatically map out onto the framework that the admission team used to evaluate leadership potential or career trajectory. Not because the work is insignificant, absolutely not, but because the translation hasn't been done and they're not fully understanding what it is that you have done that would add value to an MBA classroom. That's the problem this session is built around, understanding how programs actually read a background like yours and what's visible to them versus what you assume they see, and the difference, the gap, it needs to be filled. When healthcare professionals look at their profile, they see impact, patient volume, care complexity, protocols built, teams trained, and so many other things that you have done. But when an Adcom at MIT, Booth, or other schools read the same profile, they're looking for something specific. What they're looking for is evidence of how you've led when the stakes are organizational rather than clinical. A physician, for example, who manages a 40-person unit may have experienced more leadership than a consultant who ran a 2-person engagement. But the consultant's profile will read more legible because the language of that work maps onto what business schools are trained to identify. Pharma candidates face a related version of this problem. Think associate director or VP titles at a pharma organization that carries, those titles carry structural ambiguity. The hierarchy in those companies doesn't necessarily translate neatly to a business school's model of career progression. And Adcoms who aren't specialists in the pharma org structure will often misread seniority and misread those experiences. So it is the applicant's job to really be crystal clear in the context of the role, the impact, and the commitments that you've made. You must communicate what you have done so that the Adcom can understand what your experiences have been and can identify how those experiences are going to add value to the classroom. The gap between where you are and where you need to be in the context of your application. Again, this is in the context of your application. We're not dismissing or diminishing the level of work and the experiences that you've had. But you are communicating to a particular audience, and that's really the question here. And oftentimes, that gap is really difficult to see from the inside of your own profile. The two programs that we have here on the screen, just as examples, are really not interchangeable, and that matters for anyone who is looking at healthcare, who is treating M7 or T10 or T15 as a single category of schools. Even if you're focusing on schools that are known for healthcare specific training, they are very different from one another. So let's take HBS, for example. HBS is specifically looking for evidence of ownership, not clinical ownership over a patient, but organizational ownership, the moment where you identified a problem and drove a solution without being asked. That patterns appear in healthcare careers, but it rarely gets surfaced because the instinct is to describe what the role required rather than what you decided to do and how you made the decisions along the way. Wharton's analytical rigor should theoretically favor pharma candidates, but let's say you come from R&D and your work often reads very technically and can, in the application, can read technically deep and functionally narrow without a deliberate framing around the business decisions embedded in those moments in the work that you have done. Understanding how a specific program reads your specific background before you write a single word of your application changes the way you build your application. That in and of itself doesn't always mean that it's only dependent on research you do on the program's website or the few conversations you have with students. It requires a level of evaluation that's specific to your profile. So it requires a lot of introspection around what your experiences have been and have the ability to discern how those experiences translate to a business ecosystem. And really, that is the work that we do here at SIA. So let's say if you're a physician or a clinical researcher and someone asks you why you're pursuing an MBA, the answer that comes most naturally is probably some version of healthcare consulting, pharma strategy, healthcare operational leadership, and those are real post-MBA goals and pathways. They're also the categories Adcoms at every program have read in hundreds of applications from healthcare professionals. The issue isn't that the goals are wrong. It's that the goals stated at the category level doesn't demonstrate that you understand what the MBA actually changes about your trajectory. Adcoms are evaluating whether you have a specific credible case for why business training created something that clinical expertise alone cannot. Healthcare consulting doesn't answer that question. What's worth understanding is that when a healthcare candidate does have a specific credible goals case, the combination of the clinical credibility and business leadership intent reads differently than almost any other background in the application pool. Now, the problem isn't really your background, is that most candidates haven't done the work to surface what makes their version of that path distinct. That it's challenging to do if you haven't done it before, and especially if you are moving in a new space that you have previously had. And it cannot be done at the essay stage. It has to be done pre-writing a single essay in your application journey. Now, there's a specific pattern that shows up in healthcare applications with with enough regularity that it's worth naming directly. The candidate has a genuinely impressive clinical or pharma background, and the application spends considerable real estate, considerable time establishing how significant that experience is. The implicit argument is that I've done the important work, therefore I deserve a seat at Wharton or Harvard or insert any M7 or T15 school. That is really not the question the schools are asking or are looking for you to answer. For pharma candidates, the MBA as a pivot framing creates a related problem. I want to move from science to business is a common explanation for applying, and it immediately raises a question the application needs to answer in and of itself. If the pivot is the whole story, what's the strategic logic? What do you understand about the commercial development, market access, or organizational decision-making that your scientific background uniquely positions you to act on? The candidates who answer that question clearly and who can connect clinical and scientific credibility to a specific business thesis occupy a position in the applicant pool that is genuinely hard to replicate. That is the difference that is the nuance that will make your application stand out in a pool of other incredible healthcare professionals. Now, it's worth being direct that healthcare and pharma candidates are not fighting against their background. They're fighting against a version of their background that hasn't been positioned to demonstrate what it actually contains. A physician who has made resource allocation decisions, managed the clinical team through institutional change, and is now pursuing an MBA with a specific thesis about healthcare delivery at the systems level is a candidate very few programs will pass on. A pharma professional who has sat at the interface of clinical data and commercial strategy and can articulate a specific perspective on where the drug development decisions go wrong occupies a position that finance or consulting candidates simply cannot replicate. So you will see, if you've done some research, that there are M7s and top 15 schools have healthcare pathways. And those pathways exist precisely because these programs see what this background can do when it's been built and framed with a lot of clarity. Now, the gap is not the experience, it's whether the application surfaces the right reading of that experience. And this is a positioning problem, and it's definitely solvable, but the solution is not adding more evidence. It's a fundamental different construction of how you are communicating your experiences to an audience that is not healthcare trained. At some point in this process, most healthcare candidates hit a version of the same wall: strong academics, relevant experience, a competitive test, GMAT or GRE, and an application that still doesn't feel differentiated. The instinct, again, is to add more examples, more explanations, more context. The gap isn't really your information. It's how you structure the information that you have. The profile isn't organized around the thesis that makes the case for the candidate, will hit a wall in the process. Building that thesis requires understanding how each target program actually evaluates healthcare background. So HBS doesn't read clinical leadership the way Wharton does, and Kellogg doesn't read pharma credentials the way Booth does. The candidates who get it right aren't necessarily the ones with the most impressive records, but are the ones whose positioning gives the committee a clear, specific reason to say yes that goes beyond that strong resume. That level of work is definitely not assembled through research and revision on your own. or if you work on your own. It requires an external reader on what your materials is actually communicating versus what you intend to communicate. And that sometimes is the biggest gap. It is much more difficult for you to have someone read your background if they themselves are also in the healthcare space, because you two face the same or speak the same language, and you are speaking in your application to business schools, you are speaking to someone who doesn't speak your language. So the distance between intent and reception is exactly where strong candidates either hold a strong position or hold a seat, or they fall short of what the admission team is looking for. And closing that gap, obviously, is what we do here at SIA every single year. There are also gaps that appear in healthcare candidates with enough consistency that they're worth naming directly. The first is leadership evidence that exists outside a clinical or scientific hierarchy, meaning leadership where you were accountable for organizational outcomes, not just clinical ones. This evidence is often genuinely present in healthcare candidates' history, but rarely positioned as leadership. So if you've had committee work, operational redesign, institutional initiatives during periods of change, these appear in a resume as context rather than evidence of your readiness to move into business conversation. The second gap is business exposure with real decision-making weight. Sitting in a strategy meeting as a clinical subject matter expert is different from being a person accountable for a business decision. And Adcoms can definitely distinguish between the two. When you blur the line, it's where you are creating more confusion than you are creating clarity. And the third gap is harder to close quickly. Institutional visibility outside clinical or pharma context. A candidate with strong reputation inside a hospital system or large pharma company is not necessarily visible in any way an Adcom can verify or contextualize. This matters more to HBS and Stanford, where the committee is evaluating how a candidate shows up in the world, not just the professional experiences that you've had. So being able to bring these into your application will definitely help you close that gap much faster. Obviously, not all gaps are equally urgent, and treating them the same, it's definitely a strategic error that I see oftentimes in this particular population. So there's a category of gap that is positioning based. The evidence exists in your profile, but isn't organized in a way that reads clearly to an Adcom. Those gaps are addressable without changing anything in your career. So that's the easiest gap. Then there's a category that is profile-based. The underlying evidence doesn't exist yet and needs to be built. A physician who hasn't built any business exposure is in a fundamentally different position than a physician who has built it but hasn't surfaced it in their profile. Whether you have time to close profile level gaps before your target cycle depends on where you are in the calendar, which program you're targeting, and whether the specific gap you're carrying can be accelerated or requires time to develop credibly. Some healthcare candidates who intend to apply in round one of a given cycle should be applying in round one of the following cycle because they need that time frame to build the gap that is missing. This doesn't mean that their profile is weak, but because the gap they're carrying won't close in 4 months. They need that time. And a premature application is harder to position and to recover from than taking that delay for 1 year. Everything I covered in today's session applies to healthcare and pharma candidates generally. So wherever you fall in the hierarchy of this space. What I haven't necessarily answered is how any of it maps to your specific profile. And that's the part that determines your specific outcome. Whether the gap you're carrying are addressable through positioning or require time in your career or more time to develop depends on the material we obviously have not seen today. So whether you're targeting HBS, Wharton, Kellogg, Booth, Sloan, these are all the right schools, or these can all be the right schools. But whether you apply to all of them or whether you apply to one or two are with a meaningfully stronger fit, given your specific interest, is a question that requires more than general program knowledge. So whether your goals framing is landing in the way you intend is something you won't be able to evaluate accurately from inside your own application. You do need outsider perspective. And doing that sooner rather than later will help make sure that you are in alignment, whether you are in determining where your gap lies. Are you aligned but just need positioning? Do you need more time? And you definitely want to do that sooner rather than later. If you want an external reader, there are two ways that you can connect with C Admissions. First is a free profile evaluation. This is a written assessment of your competitiveness and I essentially identify what needs to be addressed before you apply. If you submit a profile evaluation, I ask that you please include your resume because it helps me really assess more than just quick answers in a form, but rather it helps me see what your experiences have been. Now, if you don't have an updated resume, that's totally okay. Submit what you have. And the second way to connect with us is to schedule a consultation where we look at the full picture of your candidacy and your target programs together and discuss ways of moving forward and seeing if a collaboration is something that makes more sense. So we have about 6 minutes left in today's session. I would love to see if there are any questions that have come in. You're so welcome. Perfect. Okay, so let's get some questions that came through the registration first. All right. Do admission committees expect healthcare candidates to demonstrate business exposure before applying? Yes. If you have decided that you want to do an MBA, you are essentially saying that I know that with business, I can solve X problem. If you haven't had exposure, even slight exposure, tangential exposure, it is very difficult for you to make that thesis or argue that thesis, essentially. So you want to have some type of exposure in the operations of your organization, in the strategy of your organization, that will help the admission committee see that the perspective you're bringing to the table is valuable to the cohort as a whole, but also that what it is you want to do is also attainable because you have spent enough time reflecting and understanding the problems you will face, and you know how an MBA is going to help you shorten the gap between where you are now and where you want to be. Maybe we can move the presentation so I can actually see better the page. Okay, there we go. Perfect. All right, next question. Why might a technically heavy CV raise red flags for business school applications? This is an excellent question. I see a lot of healthcare professionals who have very technically heavy resumes, and that is natural because that's the space you're in. However, for business schools that are looking to build leaders, the technicals are oftentimes what distract. It is very difficult for them to understand how especially if they don't understand the technical itself, how does this apply to the business school ecosystem? How are your experiences and your perspectives going to add value to a classroom, a cohort of people who may not be in healthcare themselves? You're not getting a healthcare specific degree, right? You are going to business school, will be in the community of individuals who are not healthcare professionals. And are you going to be able to add value to that conversation? If your communication style, which is what your applications are telling, is very technical, the admission team will say you are going to build walls and not create an open and sort of communal conversation. Jargon is oftentimes the language that the people in that ecosystem speak. And if you can't move beyond that jargon, that means you're not letting anyone else in your ecosystem to join you, to learn from you. And that is one of the reasons that technically heavy CV challenges the admission team in terms of being able for them to see what value you bring. All right, last question. Are there specific extracurriculars or side projects that tend to strengthen healthcare MBA profiles? Not necessarily. I would say if you are focused on extracurriculars at this point, obviously you have already are completed with your college degree, with wherever you are in your career journey. Your extracurriculars that you're working on now should be in alignment with where you want to go. So don't just work on extracurriculars just to have a line on your resume, but rather make sure that the extracurriculars that you are joining are in alignment with what you care about deeply, what you value deeply, and it's moving the needle in showcasing uniqueness in your profile. And I use the word unique, but I really want you to not think of the word unique as no one else in the world has ever done what I'm doing. It doesn't need to be that kind of unique. The uniqueness of what I'm talking about is really how you have approached a particular problem in society through your extracurriculars, and how that perspectives will add value also to the MBA classroom. Excellent. So on Monday next week, so March 9th, if you're watching any time between now and then, I will be joining GMAT Club on their platform. It is at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and we'll talk about profile, why people get rejected. So whether you have applied or about to apply, that is a good session to join. It's going to be very Q&A based, so there's not going to be a presentation. And you can learn what elements to avoid in your application. So join us then. We'll continue to post additional events on our events page. So definitely subscribe so that you'll be notified as new activities are added to our platform. Thank you for watching, and I will see you either Monday or next week, Thursday.
Hi, I'm Susan Barashai, founder of C Admissions. If you'd like to go deeper into MBA strategy, watch the next video here. And if you want more insights on building a standout application, click here to subscribe.